Welcome to Virtualize Everything and another home lab video. So 1 week ago, on November 20th, I published a video about how I got Web Machine N7 running on VirtualBox. Well, a lot has changed, including the fact that I have now found the flag inside of Web Machine N7. As you can see here, displayed on my desktop. I want to show you the journey about how I got there and some of the information I learned along the way, as well as how we got N7 running on Proxmox. That's right, a VirtualBox VM running on Proxmox and able to be used so we could hack it on an isolated network. So with that, let's move over to Proxmox and start looking a little bit at the setup. So here's the Proxmox web interface, and we'll center it here on the desktop, so hopefully it's a little bit easier for you to see in this video. You can see I have various VMs running, some for personal projects, some for videos, and the rest are set up for this particular capture the flag event. So I've actually labeled all of the containers and VMs that were used with tags. And if you haven't seen much about tags, that's something that we did a video on later last week, actually on November 21st. So one day after the Web Machine video. But I had to do some creative thinking here. And if we go over to our server, which I called PVE, and we select networks, you can see I have a bridge here, and I've actually even added a USB Ethernet port. Now, we're using a laptop, and I only have one Ethernet port, so we added a USB Ethernet port. I have many videos on setting that type of stuff up on my channel, but I tried to create a bridge with no port at all because it's basically what I wanted, just a switch or hub type connection inside of Proxmox. And Open vSwitch might have actually been better for this, but I was kind of in a hurry and working over the weekend in between family things and family visiting and whatnot, and I just didn't want to research Open vSwitch. Maybe for the next CTF that I try, Open vSwitch might be something fun to try here. But what I did is I took that USB port, not connected to any Ethernet at all, and I just tied it into a bridge. So what that basically does, and if we hit edit, you can see there's no IP address on here or anything, and the comment I just put for CTF. So it creates a network here going out of my Proxmox machine that I can hack over. That's basically, even though it's virtualized, it's basically completely isolated, and my Proxmox machine can't even communicate with it because we've established no IP address on my Proxmox machine. So hopefully it's an isolated network. If any of you guys have some more insights for that on me, please go ahead and drop a comment. I'd love to learn from them. But that was my goal, to create an isolated network inside of Proxmox that I could do this type of lab experiment on. Then we moved over because if you look at Web Machine here, if you look at its network configuration right here, it's DHCP service enabled. And this is really great for people to easily deploy this and be able to work with it on a network and whatnot. But we needed some way of assigning a IP address to this. And again, following along with some of the work that I had done with VBox, I just quickly chose to deploy a container with DHCP instead of setting this up in Kali. I probably could have set this up in Kali. I thought it was best just to quickly create a container, build that into a DHCP server, and then switch it over to this network. So you can see right here, the last line I left off on was actually my network where I switched the bridge by clicking edit over to VMBR2, which was our CTF bridge, from VMBR0, which was our bridge that will expose the container to the internet so we can do updates and whatnot. And I also had, from the point I used DHCP to establish to the internet, download the DHCP server and apply all updates to the container. And then I set it to a static IP address because, of course, it's DHCP server on the network. It's not going to be able to send itself an IP address. So I set that to static here and change the bridge. If we open the console for this particular container, you can see that ISC DHCP server was used for this particular communication, and you can see that it assigned an IP address to Kali here. And I'm not seeing it, but it also had assigned the IP address to the web machine N7. Now, for the configuration here on this server, it was pretty simple. I commented out these optional domain lines, set up the default lease time. Since this is the only DHCP server on this network, I made it authentative, and then I started here by just uncommenting a few lines, editing them to the 192.168 range. I chose 60 because it was off from anything on my network, which just hopefully would help anything if it did escape for whatever reason, for anything that I missed in my brain and configuration or the way Proxmox works. Hopefully my router would catch it and contain it a little bit better so it didn't hop IP addresses or something weird like that. So set it to a range outside of my network that my Proxmox server is connected to, set my subnet mask. I also uncommented default lease time and maximum lease time, and basically just left them there, whatever they were set as, which they're the same up top. And then I restarted the server with systemctl. And then, as you saw, I was monitoring the status just to make sure all my configuration worked. A lot of times when you set up ISC, it seems like it doesn't come up and you have to go back to that configuration file and find whatever flaw you made. So got it all up and running, and that's what you see here. Now, the process for actually getting Web Machine N7, which is a VM up and running, is a little bit more complex, but it's fairly simple actually. So what you need to do is basically follow along with the same process that I use to get something like Home Assistant up and running. And we don't have Home Assistant here, but I do have videos on that I've done in the past. And I think even some of my early videos I did on like BusyBox and stuff like that. Because although we've strayed a long ways, and I call this my first CTF, the original reason I got into Proxmox so long ago now, I think it was 4 years ago, was to do this type of work. And some of our first videos were about that. But the process here, just for all of you so you don't have to go search that video down, was to create a VM, and we'll give it a name here. I'm not going to actually create this one, but I did test, and now this tags feature is unlocked, so I added a tag just to identify it. Then we went on to OS, and I actually just selected don't use media. We're not going to use any media. It is a Linux system, so we selected that. Systems, we left alone. I didn't select anything. We didn't really know much about our system yet, and we're not going to be able to install software. So because this is a VirtualBox VM, it's not going to have QEMU guest agent installed in it or anything else, so there's no sense in using it. Went on to disks. I just deleted the disk because we're not going to use that. We're actually going to import our own disk into it from Web Machine later on. Then for CPUs, I gave it 2 cores just so it had enough power. I left the x86 64V2 ASA default alone. Memory, I let it have 2 gigs. And for network, I just configured it to my second bridge, that bridge that we built early on where everything's isolated and now we have a DHCP server on it. And then I hit next and I finished it at that point and built it. I'm going to close this screen here and not build this today because I already have one and I don't need one. But then I went off and I selected the server, clicked shell, and this is where the real fun gets going. So we'll move this off to the side a little bit where I can click on it from behind screens and show you a little bit of what I did. So the first thing I need to do is actually get an web machine N7 onto the machine, and I can do that by coming up here and I can right click on this and I can copy link address. Once the link address is copied, I made a folder. My folder was called Web Machine, and inside of Web Machine, I used the command wget and I paste in the URL. This downloaded directly to my Proxmox server the Web Machine OVA file. And you notice it's not QCOW2 or anything else, it's OVA, and that's for VirtualBox. So I got the file, it's on my server, and you might be asking what to do with it now. Well, from there you're gonna get the OVA file that's seen right here and none of the rest of these files. But what you need is the VMDK file that's actually packaged inside of the OVA file. And to do that, you're gonna need to actually unpack the OVA file, because the OVA file is basically a tarball. So to do that, you're going to use the command tar-xvf webmachine n7.ova. So we're going to take that OVA file, we're going to unpack that tarball, and at that point you get all of these other files. You get the ISO file, you get the VMDK file, you keep your OVA file, and you get this web machine MF file as well as the web machine OVF file. Well, looking at our VirtualBox configuration, I basically knew that this ISO was some type of CD-ROM file in there, and it didn't appear when I removed it from our VirtualBox setup that it needed that ISO. Everything seemed to come up and it seemed to work and it seemed to do everything. So we disregarded that. We could have passed that in by moving it to a separate folder and actually loading it into a CD-ROM in the virtual machine, but it didn't seem like we needed it. So we just focused on this file, this VMDK file right here. And I need to get that into the virtual machine. So what we're going to do is use another command that's qm import disk and then the VM number. In this case, it was 111. If we go back to our Proxmox, you can see our number right here, 111 for our virtual machine. And that could be any virtual machine you set up, 112, whatever number you give, that goes in there. And then you tell it the file, which is the web machine N7. And because there's spaces and stuff, it goes in between quotes, just exactly how LS shows it in its print screen here just above. Then we have to specify the drive, which is going to be local LVM on my machine. If you have ZFS or something else, it'll be local, whatever that is. And then we're going to tell Proxmox that we want to format this into a QCOW2 file, which is what Proxmox uses for its disk images. At that point, a long screen's going to run, and that screen's going to run usually between 2 and 5 minutes, and it's actually going to import it into your server. And if you click here and we go to hardware, you can actually see a disk that I had tried importing prior that didn't work right, and that was due to just some mistakes I made and some of my directions and notes I was following, but I left it here just so I could show you how to kind of do everything. So with this unused disk that'll show up, yours will be 0. Mine's called 1 because I had 2. You hit edit, and then this will allow you to actually add this as a hard drive. So of course I have an SSD, so I checked discard. If you don't have an SSD, you don't need to do that. And then you press add. This will add it in to your Proxmox machine as a hard drive, just as mine did. And then you have to go to options, boot order, edit, and I turn off networking and CD-ROM just because I don't want to wait for it to figure any of them out if I've made a mistake. and I just select that particular SCSI0 hard drive that I added in, which is right here, and I press OK. So now our boot order is configured, and we can start our machine and we open our console. If everything goes well, we'll get a console image. Here we got a Kali console image because Web Machine N7 was built on top of Kali, and that's basically the same image that we got when everything loaded up in VBox. It's basically the same image we got when it started in VBox. So I was pretty confident this was up and running. But what I did at that point is I actually headed back to my DHCP server, or that container that I created. I opened a console and I just ran that status command, which was left running. But if you run it again, which obviously it's not going to now because it's been a while, it'll start telling you IP addresses for the latest machine that it assigned an IP address to, which in this case actually was this line 11 that it assigned it to. You can see up here 12 is my Kali box that I'm going to actually attempt to hack Web Machine N7 with. So we had the IP address, but what fun in hacking is it really if we don't go ahead and actually go through the steps? So I pretended I didn't see it, but I did a little happy dance in my chair, knowing that this was running and the network was configured correctly and everything was up and running. Most of you don't know, maybe if you did watch my VirtualBox video, I struggled for probably 2 days trying to get networking up and running the first time I tried deploying this, and really kind of learned quite a bit about what I needed for a networking for this machine. Kind of felt stupid, felt like I should have known it, but hey, that's part of learning, and that's why we do home lab stuff at home where we don't have to have anybody else see it. So I have an IP address. I was excited. It is time to go off and start our Kali VM. This is a copy. I have a template down here that I clone, or at least that's what I do plan to do, so that every one of these projects I can kind of just clone a fresh copy of Kali or whatever I want as I move ahead. If I need to wipe something out or whatnot, make a mistake, I can just redo Kali quickly and easily. Clicking on console will get me this window back here to where we've completed things. So long story short, you start out by doing some nmaps. You need to discover the network. So in order to do that, we're going to open a terminal window, and I ran sudo. Not all nmap commands need sudo, but I just kind of put it in there. And I knew my network IP address was 192.168.60 from my configured DHCP server, so I just ran a -SN, which was a little s and a capital N, and then I did a scan on 192.168, or 192.168.60/24, which is telling nmap to scan the whole network. So nmap's going to replace that 0 with 1 to 254 because we said it was a class 24 network. So running this, it took 2-3 minutes, but everything was much, much faster than if we had run this in VirtualBox. And I think part of that is my laptop cores overheating and maybe just being a little less powerful. My laptop's newer than the laptop that's actually running this, but the laptop that's running this is a little bit better as far as cooling wise, much beefier heatsink, whatnot. So we can see 1, which we know is our assigned DHCP server, and 12 is our Kali machine, and we can identify that by running an IPA command here in a second. So we know 11 is our web server. It also tells us that port 80 is open, which gives us more information that it's a web server. And you can see our machine is 12. So at this point, we know the IP addresses of everything on our network, and we can kind of begin working with it. We can actually even go over and we can view the initial web page, which I did here by opening Firefox and just navigating to that IP address, and it's a cool looking thing. If you flip around here, there's, some information or whatnot. But where do you go from here? And this was a question I was asking myself. This was my first capture of the flag, and I knew there was a bunch of walkthroughs out. And I probably, for somebody that started studying and spent 2 years studying cybersecurity for a 4-year degree, maybe should have known more. I didn't really take much classes on doing this type of stuff. So at this point, I jumped out to a walkthrough, kind of just hoping to do a few of these with walkthroughs and kind of figure out how people start. And then I can develop my own workflows and my own styles and go from there. And I found two different walkthroughs. Both of them hosted on sites that had different URLs, but they seemed very similar. I used very similar logoing, and each of them had a little bit different of their own style. All of them start out with Nmap. They use some different Nmap commands than me, but they basically do the same thing. And then they go into a process called web server enumeration. And this is where I spent the last week and some of the weekend and really found a lot of my performance issues with VBox rather than Proxmox. So you're talking like an hour runtime on my word list for Proxmox, and we were talking 2 days to unfinished because my laptop would overheat and the VM would crash and whatnot when trying to run this on my laptop. I did run this word list with these configurations that they show right here, and I got some of the information. I basically matched this guide. And at that point, I was able to load this exploit HTML, and I did this part here on VirtualBox, and I didn't recreate it on Proxmox. But if I bring up a screenshot from what I did there, you can see that I got the flag and I had found the exploit.html. So I view that, and you have to go in at this point and somehow download the URL, the exploit.html page, and set up a web server. I chose to do this again in a virtual machine. I would have done it in a container on Proxmox, set up Apache, done a wget to download that, and then reloaded that on the new URL so that I could go in and edit the lines. And what this guide is telling you to do, and I don't have any information on, unfortunately, it was talked about in the previous video, is what it does is it points to, and this isn't as good, he's showing the edits. This one, there you go, it points to localhost, so it's actually shoving all of those PHP requests back to your machine and not back to the server. So you have to go in and edit the IP address there, and you get the first part of the flag, which you can see here in my screenshot that I took, me receiving here. It's not the full flag. So you haven't finished. You need to go hunting out more. You haven't made full access here. So at that point that the IP address is fixed, you can click the submit button, and that sends you this flag, and it displays it right there. So now it's time to move both guides. If you read them, go back, and one guy builds upon a video that he watched. The other guy somehow manages to change the actual permissions inside of his container so that he can view this and find out this file exists. But either way, they both find enter network. And this is maybe the one point where I did something different. And what I did different here, kind of knowing where I needed to go and knowing what I needed for information to get there, was I went out to the internet and I decided I was going to make a larger word list. And I actually think it might be somewhere here in Proxmox. I set up a VM or actually a container, and I went out and I used wget, pull a bunch of information, or actually word lists, down from GitHub. And I pulled, I think, 6 or 7 down here into that VM. And then I used SCP to get them here onto the desktop of my Mac. And I began a pretty daunting task. So here's all the different files or folders that I downloaded. And I don't even think this is where they initially came in. I don't even know if I have anything. So I had a bunch of files and I went through them. I pulled out every word list that I thought would kind of be a word list that Dirbuster would use and would contribute to HTML enumeration. I pulled them all down. Then I used Python and various different scripts inside of Python, which kind of was saved here in this folder. A bunch of different scripts and files were created to clean this data, essentially. So I took all of those files that are in the Dirbuster directory, I combined them into one file. I initially called it wordlist.txt, and then I went through, I sorted for duplicate lines, being that there's multiple things. I sorted for comment lines, removing comments. I then viewed the data and I noticed that there was a lot of other like lines with periods and symbols and question marks and things like that that necessarily would not appear in a directory or even a file name inside of Linux. So I went through multiple different steps of cleaning those features out, reloading the word list. Now, every time I had to reload the word list, I had to use a tool like Nano because traditional like text viewers were crashing. We were looking at 100 and some odd meg file. I think I got it down to 80, and then through a few more cleaning steps, got it down to like 35. So I had a working word list, which I'll show you the information on here. But here's the actual word list that I created from just pulling all of them together. Now, I could have probably gone into any one word list, added the enter network thing, but I felt that wasn't fair because I wouldn't have known unless I was looking at a guide. So I wasn't going to go that way. So I just combined every word list I could find quickly on GitHub, hoping that I got enter network. And you can see I'm down at 32.6 in the file and all of the random stuff that is in this particular word list. So basically a giant word list, much bigger than all of the others, sorted, cleaned, and I then had to move my Kali system, this system here in Proxmox by clicking on it, going to hardware, going to networks, edit, and change it to the VMBR 0 bridge. And I used SCP just to upload it, which meant I had to turn on SSH. That's very common. I'm not going to walk you guys through what I did there, but I activated SSH. And then I used SCP to upload the word list to this Kali server. And you can see here, these files were created later on as I was learning some software. But there's my word list. It was uploaded to Kali from my local system that I built. And then I used this program called Dirbuster again. Remember, we used it to find that profile.php page, but we were looking as well as the export.html page, which is what we use to get the first part of that flag. But we were looking for enter, and I have a screenshot of the configurations I put in here. Or no, this is a different time of running it. I don't have a screenshot of the configurations. Anyways, I used the same configurations that were given to us in the top guide where we found the other information, minus I used browse and I didn't select this word list. I selected my own word list. And I ran this here on Proxmox. Took about an hour totally because every time it would find one of these subdirectories, it would scan that entire subdirectory for all of the other subdirectories in the list. And so the time would bounce around a little bit. But it was about an hour. And I found Enter Network, this mythical network. And here's what you get. Now, really following along the guide, I'm lost at this point. Totally lost. Don't even know what I'm doing. Don't know what I'm looking at. But I continued on. So they talked about cookies. I used inspect and I put foreign data in here and sent it. And I got this cookie out. Well, great. I have the cookie. Now, from reading the guide, again, actually, here from reading this guide, they get into inspecting that cookie and finding information from that cookie. And I probably should have followed along with some of that and learned about more about inspecting the cookie, but I didn't. I moved right on to mapping the SQL and looking into SQL injection. At this point, we used Burp Sweep and I followed their guide near one for one. I did try Chat GPT a little bit. I looked for other tools other than Burp Sweep because Burp Sweep is kind of a community paid program and I don't know. I just wanted something different. So I looked at some. I ended up coming back to Burp Sweep as that was the general thing that Chat GPT even said people use for this. And what I did with Burp Sweep, which I don't even know if it's up here, doesn't seem to be up here anymore, is to set it up. And I set it up as a intercept. So you open it, takes a little bit to load. Temporary project in memory, open it up, and you start Burp Sweep. And then you can go to proxy. You start the intercept proxy by turning it on. You're going to open another browser, and I can take you through this. So let's just copy this URL. We'll open their browser and you can load that and you get the file. Well, that's great. You have to hit forward at this point, which forwards it on to the actual server and clears this window again where we get the username and password. We give it random credentials and we hit send. That's when we get this packet. I saved this packet and I forwarded it, and then I just did it again. And at that time, I got this particular packet, just like I got here, and I saved that. Now, from the guide, I knew that this was more the packet I was looking for, as it kind of had the user credentials here in it, which is what their screenshot showed, versus the first packet that didn't have that information. Then I opened a command line and I started using this SQL map injection, and I think this is the same information. I think I used the commands from actually this guide. Yeah, I did. So you save the file, you go here and you go actions and you go to save file, save item, and you save the file off. You tell it's a TXT file and save it away. So then you have a file path where that information's found. DBS, you scan the whole entire thing, and you're going to find that there's 4 databases in this. And of those 4 databases, you want to dump the machine database. That's what you see here. We use SQL map again to do that, and we tell it to dump the machine database. At the point that you dump the machine database, it's going to run for a little bit longer, and then as it runs, I think it was 30 or so minutes that it ran. At that point, once you dump it, it's going to show you the database, and that's the point you retrieve the flag here for Web Machine N7. Now, I know this is a fairly long video. It's probably going to edit out somewhere around 25 to 30 minutes long, but I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you learned something about Web Machine N7, at least learned enough that you can get this set up and running on your own Proxmox server from me. And you enjoyed this walkthrough guide about how you can get the flag for Web Machine N7. I know most of this isn't my own work. I'm not trying to claim it is, but as the only video that I found on YouTube and the guide talks about on YouTube is from a guy that's not speaking in English. I'm hoping to provide YouTube with a English speaking walkthrough guide on not only how to get this set up and running on Proxmox, but how to actually go through the steps of successfully retrieving the flag from Web Machine N7. As always, I hope you enjoyed this content. Please like, share, and subscribe to continue getting more Proxmox and virtualization related content from Virtualize Everything, as well as to receive information about different Proxmox setups and other things. So, with that, please have a good night.